I didn't lose my marriage in a single moment. I lost it slowly, over 365 days, while two people I trusted were living a second life right under my roof. My name is Ethan Walker, I'm 41 years old, and until recently, I thought I had built something solid, the kind of life people in my neighborhood would nod at with quiet respect, a 2-story house in a quiet suburb outside Denver, a 3-car garage, a backyard I spent 2 summers landscaping myself, and a wife I believed in more than I believed in anything else, Sophia Walker. The woman who used to greet me at the door with a smile that made the long hours worth it, and then there was Ryan Cole. My best friend for over a decade, the guy who helped me move into this house, who stood next to me at my wedding, who I trusted enough to hand over my spare key without a second thought, because that's what you do when you think your circle is solid, when you think loyalty is something you've already proven and don't need to question anymore, and for a long time, everything looked exactly like that, normal, stable, predictable. The kind of life where problems are small and manageable, a late bill here, a long week at work there, nothing that makes you stop and ask if the foundation itself is cracked, and looking back now, that's the part that bothers me the most, not the betrayal itself, but how normal everything felt while it was happening, how I would wake up at 6:30 every morning, pour my coffee, check emails from clients, and kiss my wife goodbye before heading out, while somewhere in that same routine, something else was quietly unfolding behind my back, something I didn't see. Or maybe something I chose not to see, because it's easier to trust than to question the people closest to you. I used to tell myself that, used to believe that if you build your life the right way, if you work hard, provide, show up every single day, then the people around you will do the same, that loyalty is a given, not a variable. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined at the time, was that the very things I was most proud of, my house, my money, my trust, had become the exact tools they were using against me, and the worst part is, it didn't start with something obvious. No dramatic confession, no late-night argument, no single moment where everything shattered at once. It started quietly, almost invisibly, in the kind of small details you brush off without thinking, a schedule that didn't quite line up, a message that felt just slightly off, a presence in my own home that started to feel different, but I ignored it, because that's what you do when you believe in the life you've built. You protect it, you explain things away. You give people the benefit of the doubt, especially when one of them is your wife, and the other is the man you've trusted like a brother. And if you had asked me back then, if anything felt wrong, I would have told you no, everything was fine, better than fine actually. I would have smiled, taken a sip of my coffee, and said I was one of the lucky ones. But the truth is, luck has nothing to do with it, because while I was out there working, paying the mortgage, funding the life I thought we were building together, something else was happening inside those walls, something that didn't belong to me anymore, and I didn't realize it yet. But my house wasn't just my house, my money wasn't just my money, and my trust had already been spent long before I ever thought to check the balance. The first time something fell off, it was so small I almost laughed at myself for noticing it, a detail so insignificant it did not deserve the weight I gave it. But once your mind catches on something, it does not let go. It just sits there quietly, waiting for you to look at it again from a different angle. And for me, it was a Wednesday evening, nothing special, just another long day that stretched past 9 o'clock. The kind of day where you come home expecting silence, maybe a light on in the kitchen, maybe the sound of the television in the background. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw Ryan's truck parked on the street, not in the driveway where guests usually parked, but off to the side like it did not want to be noticed. And I remember thinking it was odd, not wrong, just out of place, because Ryan had always been the kind of guy who walked in through the front door like he belonged there, not someone who hovered on the edges. And when I stepped inside, the house smelled different, not bad, not unfamiliar, just rearranged, like walking into a room where the furniture had been moved an inch to the left, enough that your body feels it before your mind does. And Sophia was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, her phone in her hand, smiling in a way that did not quite reach her eyes when she saw me. And Ryan was there too, sitting at the island, a glass of water in front of him like he had been there a while, like this was not a quick visit but something more settled, more routine. and I told myself it was nothing, that this was normal, that friends stopped by, that schedules overlap, that I was reading into things that did not matter, and Ryan stood up, clapped me on the shoulder, asked about work. The same easy tone he had used for years, the same rhythm, nothing forced, nothing that would raise a red flag if you were not already looking for one. And Sophia turned back to the stove, stirring something that smelled like garlic and butter, telling me dinner would be ready in 10 minutes. Like this was just another night, like I had walked into exactly what I should have expected, and maybe that was the strangest part, how normal they made it look, how seamless it felt. Like I had stepped into a scene that had already been playing long before I arrived, and I remember standing there for a second longer than usual, just watching them. Not in a suspicious way, not yet, but in that quiet observational way you get when something does not fully line up but you cannot explain why. And later that night, after Ryan left, after the dishes were done and the house settled into that familiar quiet, I noticed something else, something even smaller. Sophia's phone lit up on the nightstand, just for a second, a notification that she turned face down almost immediately, too quickly, like a reflex. And when I asked who it was, she said it was just one of her friends, her tone light, casual, the kind of answer you do not question. Unless you are already questioning everything, and I nodded, let it go, because that is what trust looks like in real time. It looks like choosing not to dig, choosing not to press, choosing to believe the version of reality that keeps your life intact. But what I did not realize was that these moments were not isolated, they were patterns, small, consistent shifts that were stacking up just below the surface, waiting for the moment when they would finally connect into something I could not ignore. And even then, even standing there in the dark with that faint glow of her phone screen fading into nothing, I still believed I was in control of my life. I still believed I understood the people under my roof. I still believed that whatever felt off was just in my head, because the truth had not revealed itself yet. It was still patient, still building, still waiting for me to see it all at once. It was not one moment that changed everything, it was a pattern that refused to stay hidden any longer, and once I started noticing it, I could not unsee it, because the details began to repeat in ways that did not make sense unless you were willing to question the story you had been telling yourself. And for me, it started with time, not hours on a clock, but how people used it, how they moved within it, how their schedules lined up just a little too perfectly. Because Ryan started showing up more often, always when I was running late, always when I had meetings that stretched past dinner, always when I was not supposed to be home, and at first, I told myself it was coincidence, that he was just being a good friend, checking in, helping Sophia around the house, the kind of thing you appreciate when you trust someone completely. But then I noticed how comfortable he had become, not just in the house, but in the rhythm of it. Like he knew exactly where everything was without asking. Like he did not need to wait for permission anymore, and that was when the thought first crossed my mind, not as a conclusion, but as a question I did not want to ask out loud. How long has this been happening? And I remember one afternoon in particular, a Friday, I left work early because a client canceled, nothing dramatic, just an unexpected gap in the day, and I decided to come home. Not because I suspected anything, but because I wanted the quiet, the kind of quiet you only get when the house is empty. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw the garage door slightly open, not enough to signal anything urgent, just enough to suggest someone had used it recently. And as I stepped inside, I heard voices, low, casual, not arguing, not tense, just comfortable. And I froze for a second, not out of fear, but because something inside me needed that extra second to process what I was hearing, because it sounded like I was walking into a conversation that did not expect me. And when I pushed the door open, they both looked up at the same time, Sophia on the couch, Ryan sitting beside her, not too close, not inappropriate, just close enough that it felt rehearsed. Like they had practiced what normal should look like, and Sophia smiled, that same quick, controlled smile, asking why I was home early. Her tone light, but her eyes searching, measuring something, and Ryan leaned back, stretching like he had just been relaxing, making a joke about me finally taking a break from work, and I played along. I nodded, I answered, I stepped into the room like everything was exactly as it should be, but inside, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to change how I was seeing things, because from that moment on, every interaction felt like it had a second layer. Every word carried a weight it did not have before, and later that night, when I sat alone in my office, the house quiet again, I started thinking through the past year, not emotionally, but logically, like I was reviewing a project that had gone wrong, looking for where the numbers stopped adding up, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that this was not new, this was not recent. This had been building, slowly, carefully, right in front of me, and the most unsettling part was not what I was starting to suspect, it was how easily they had made it all look normal, how they had taken my routines, my absence, my trust, and turned them into something else. Entirely, something I had not yet fully understood, but something I knew, without a doubt, was no longer something I could ignore. Once the idea took hold, it did not leave, it just sat there quietly, turning everything I thought I knew into something I needed to verify, and that was the moment my role in my own life started to change, not all at once, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, something shifted from trust to observation, from assumption to confirmation, and I stopped reacting and started paying attention. Because if there is one thing I have learned from years in business, it is that numbers do not lie, patterns do not lie, only people do, and if I wanted the truth, I needed to stop asking questions and start collecting facts. So I began with the simplest place, the one area of my life that had always been structured, always been predictable, my finances, and at first glance, everything looked normal, bills paid on time, accounts stable, nothing that would trigger an alarm, but when I slowed down, when I looked at the details instead of the totals, I started to notice small inconsistencies, charges that did not match our usual habits, purchases made at times I knew Sophia was supposed to be somewhere else, restaurants we had not gone to together, subscriptions I did not recognize, nothing large enough to stand out on its own, but together, they formed a pattern that did not belong to the life I thought we were living, and I remember sitting there late one night. The glow of my laptop the only light in the room, scrolling through transaction after transaction. Feeling that quiet, steady realization settle in, not as a shock, but as confirmation, because the truth does not always hit like a wave, sometimes it seeps in slowly, until it is everywhere, and once I saw it in the finances, I started seeing it everywhere else, the timing of their conversations, the way Sophia's phone would go silent when I entered a room, the way Ryan's visits lined up perfectly with my schedule. And the more I observed, the more precise it became, like watching a system that had been running smoothly for a long time, one that only broke down the moment someone outside of it started paying attention, and what struck me the most was not just that they were hiding something, it was how coordinated it all felt, how deliberate, like this was not impulsive, not accidental, but something built over time, something maintained with consistency. And that was when I understood that whatever was happening had not started recently, it had been there long before I ever noticed the first crack. And instead of confronting them, instead of demanding answers I already knew they would not give me, I made a decision that surprised even me. I chose silence, not because I was unsure, but because I was sure enough to know that acting too soon would only give them the chance to adjust, to cover, to rewrite the story before I had all of it. So I kept my routine. I left for work at the same time, came home at the same time, said the same things, asked the same questions, played the same role I had always played, while quietly stepping outside of it, and from that moment on, I was no longer just living my life, I was studying it, piece by piece, detail by detail, waiting for the moment when everything would align clearly enough that there would be no room left for doubt, because I was done guessing, and I was done trusting without proof, and whatever the truth was, I was going to see it all the way through. The moment everything stopped being a suspicion and became something real did not come from a confrontation or a confession, it came from something far quieter, something that did not need interpretation, and once I saw it, there was no version of reality left where I could explain it away, because up until that point, I had been working with patterns, with probabilities, with the kind of evidence that builds a case but does not close it, but what I needed was certainty, something that did not rely on assumption, something that could not be denied or reinterpreted, and that was when I made the decision to step one level deeper, not into their words, but into their actions when they believed no one was watching, and it started with access, not in a dramatic way, not breaking into anything that was locked, but simply using what was already available to me, because this was my house, my network, my system, and over time, I had built everything to be efficient, connected, easy to manage, including the home security system that I rarely checked beyond the occasional notification, and that night, sitting alone in my office, I opened the app and scrolled back, not looking for something specific, just letting the timeline run, watching the quiet, ordinary clips of deliveries, empty rooms, lights turning on and off, the kind of footage you forget exists because it never matters, until it does, and then I saw it, not something dramatic, not a single moment that screamed betrayal, but something far more telling, repetition, consistency, a rhythm that matched everything I had been noticing. Ryan arriving during hours I was supposed to be away, staying longer than a casual visit would justify. Moving through the house with a familiarity that was no longer subtle, and Sophia, appearing in those same frames, not surprised, not reacting, just present, like this was part of their normal routine. And I remember leaning back in my chair, not shocked, not angry, just still, because the truth has a way of quieting everything around it, and I let the footage play, clip after clip, day after day, until the timeline itself told the story, not in words, but in patterns that were impossible to ignore, and that was when the full picture started to form. Not just that they were close, not just that they were spending time together, but that they had built something inside my life that operated independently of me, something structured, something consistent, something that had been maintained over time with precision, and the realization did not hit like a sudden blow, it settled in like a weight, steady, undeniable, because this was no longer about suspicion, this was about confirmation, and once you reach that point, there is no going back to ignorance, no way to pretend you did not see what you just saw, and yet, even then, I did not confront them, because by that point, I understood something they did not, that knowledge, real knowledge, is power only if you control when and how it is revealed, and what they had was a system built on the assumption that I would never look closely enough to see it, and what I had now was the advantage of seeing everything while they still believed they were invisible, and that changed the equation entirely, because I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was preparing for what I was going to do next, and for the first time since this began, I felt something clear, not confusion, not doubt, but direction. Because whatever this had become, whatever they had built behind my back, I was no longer a part of it, and that meant I could decide exactly how it ended. By the time I had seen enough, the question was no longer what they were doing, it was why they believed they could do it so easily. And the answer to that was harder to accept than anything else, because it had nothing to do with them being careful, and everything to do with me being predictable. I had given them a structure they could rely on, a schedule they could map around, a level of trust that never required verification. And once I understood that, I stopped seeing myself as just the victim of what they built, and started recognizing how they had been able to build it in the first place, not because I deserved it, but because I never imagined I would need to defend against it, and that realization did something unexpected. It did not make me angry, it made me precise, because anger reacts, but precision plans, and if I was going to end this, I was not going to do it in a way that gave them any room to recover, to explain, or to shift the narrative into something that made me look irrational, so I began restructuring everything quietly. Starting with the one area they relied on the most without even realizing it, access, not just physical access to the house, but financial access, digital access, the invisible systems that made their routine possible, and I did it slowly, carefully, the same way they had built their version of things, one adjustment at a time. I changed account permissions. Not enough to trigger suspicion, just enough to limit flexibility. I rerouted certain payments, reviewed shared subscriptions, adjusted settings that controlled how and when money moved, and all of it looked normal from the outside, like routine maintenance, the kind of updates no one questions when they assume everything is still running the way it always has. And at the same time, I continued observing, not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted to understand the full scope of what they had created, how they communicated, how they coordinated, how they operated when they believed they were completely safe, and what I saw confirmed something important: they were comfortable, not cautious. They had crossed the point where they felt the need to hide every detail, because in their minds the system was stable, I was stable, and nothing was going to disrupt it. And that kind of confidence is what makes people careless, not in obvious ways, but in small assumptions, like believing no one is paying attention, like believing that routines will continue indefinitely without consequence. And that was the space I needed, because the less they suspected, the more control I had over how this would unfold. And there was one moment that made everything clear, one moment that shifted this from preparation to execution. It was a simple conversation, one I was not meant to hear. Sophia on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low, relaxed, saying something about how I would be out late again, how everything was already taken care of, how they did not need to worry, and the way she said it, not tense, not rushed, just certain, told me everything I needed to know, because that was not a plan, that was a routine, something they had repeated enough times that it no longer required thought. And standing there just outside the room, hearing that certainty in her voice, I realized something that removed any hesitation I might have had left. They were not afraid of getting caught. They were not even considering the possibility. And that meant I had one advantage they could not account for: timing. Because when someone believes they are completely in control, they never see the moment coming when they are not. And from that point on, I was no longer preparing to understand what they had done. I was preparing to decide exactly when they would find out that I already knew everything. Planning the end of something like this is not about emotion, it is about structure, about understanding how to close a system in a way that leaves no loose ends, and by that point, I knew exactly what kind of system they had built, not just emotionally, but practically, a routine that depended on my absence, a flow of money that supported their comfort, a level of access that allowed them to move freely without ever questioning it. And if I wanted to dismantle it, I could not just confront them and hope the truth would be enough, because truth without control becomes noise, and I had no intention of letting this turn into an argument where they could deny, deflect, or rewrite what had been happening for the past year. So I started designing the moment carefully, not just what I would say, but where, when, and under what conditions it would happen, because context matters more than words. And I chose a setting that meant something to all of us, a place where they would feel comfortable, where they would not expect anything outside of the usual rhythm, a Saturday evening at the house, nothing unusual, just dinner, something we had done dozens of times before, something that would not raise any suspicion. And in the days leading up to it, I made sure everything was in place, the financial adjustments finalized, the access points secured, the documentation organized in a way that told the story clearly, without room for interpretation, because I was not preparing to argue, I was preparing to present. And I remember how normal everything felt that day, how Sophia moved through the house like she always did, how Ryan showed up right on time, carrying a bottle of wine, making the same jokes, the same casual comments, completely unaware that the version of reality they had been relying on was about to collapse. And I played my part exactly as they expected. I smiled. I asked about their week. I kept the conversation light, because the last thing I wanted was to signal that anything had changed, and that was the advantage I had. They believed they understood the situation completely. They believed they knew me, how I would react, what I would tolerate, and that belief was exactly what allowed me to control the moment, because when people think they have already accounted for every variable, they stop looking for new ones. And as dinner went on, I watched them the same way I had been watching for weeks, not emotionally, but analytically, noting the small exchanges, the glances, the ease in their behavior, the kind of comfort that only comes from repetition, from believing something has become permanent. And it was in that comfort that I saw the final confirmation of what I already knew, that this was not something they planned to stop, not something they felt guilty about, but something they had accepted as part of their lives. And that realization removed any remaining hesitation I might have had, because at that point, this was no longer about discovering the truth, it was about ending it in a way that could not be undone. And as the evening settled, as the plates were cleared and the house grew quiet in that familiar way, I knew the moment had arrived, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything had stayed exactly the same, and that was the clearest signal of all, because when nothing changes, it means no one sees what is coming, and that is exactly when you have the most control over how it all unfolds. It did not begin with a raised voice or a dramatic accusation, it began with silence, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because they do not know what it means yet, and I let that silence sit there for a moment after the last glass was set down, after the casual conversation had run its course, after everything felt exactly the way it always did, and then I stood up, not abruptly. Not in a way that would signal anything emotional, just deliberate, controlled, and I remember both of them looking at me at the same time, that small shift in attention that comes when someone breaks the rhythm of a normal evening, and I walked to the counter, picked up a thin folder I had placed there earlier, something that looked ordinary enough to go unnoticed until that moment, and when I turned back, I could already see the first hint of confusion in Sophia's expression, not fear. Not yet, just a question forming before she had words for it, and I set the folder down on the table between us, not sliding it toward them, not pushing it, just placing it there like a fact that did not need to be introduced, and I spoke in the same tone I had used all evening, calm, even, controlled, because this was not about volume, it was about clarity, and I said something simple, something that did not accuse, did not explain, just opened the door they did not realize they were about to walk through. I said that I had been reviewing some things, that I had taken a closer look at how the past year had unfolded, and I watched their reactions carefully, because reactions tell you more than words ever will, and Ryan shifted slightly in his chair, not dramatically, just enough to register that something had changed, and Sophia's posture tightened in a way she probably thought was subtle, but after weeks of watching, I noticed everything. And then I opened the folder, not rushing, letting the sound of the paper itself fill the space, and I turned it so they could see, not everything at once, just enough to start connecting the pieces, timestamps, transaction records, entries that matched days and times they thought existed only between them, and I did not need to explain what any of it meant, because the pattern spoke for itself, and that was the moment everything shifted. Not because I raised my voice or demanded answers, but because they realized I was not asking anything at all. I already knew, and the room changed in a way that is hard to describe unless you have felt it. The air seemed heavier, the space between us smaller, and for the first time that night, either of them had anything ready to say, because this was not a situation they had prepared for. There was no script for this, no easy way to turn it into a misunderstanding or a coincidence, and I let that moment sit. I did not interrupt it. I did not rush to fill the silence, because silence, when it follows truth, does more work than any argument ever could, and then I added the one detail that made everything final. I told them that access had already been changed, that the accounts they relied on were no longer available in the way they had been, that the structure they had built their routine on was no longer there, and I watched as the realization settled in, not all at once, but piece by piece, as they understood that this was not just about being discovered. It was about losing control of something they had assumed was secure, and even then, I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, because I did not need to. The truth was already sitting there between us, clear, documented, undeniable, and for the first time in a year, the version of reality they had been living in no longer existed. The silence that followed did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, the way something fragile gives way under pressure. And I could see it in their faces, not panic, not yet, but the first real understanding that this was not something they could talk their way out of, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to reinterpret, and Sophia was the first to speak, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, asking a question that did not really seek an answer, something about how long I had known, and I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that only comes when you have already processed everything you needed to feel, and I told her the truth, that it did not matter when I found out, only that I understood it completely now, and Ryan shifted again, trying to find a position that made sense in a situation that no longer had one. And he started to say something about misunderstanding, about things not being what they looked like, but the words did not carry weight, not anymore. Because once the structure of a lie is exposed, it does not matter how carefully it was built, it cannot support itself, and I did not interrupt him. I let him speak just long enough for it to become clear that there was nowhere for his explanation to go, and then I closed the folder, not abruptly. Just enough to signal that the part of this that involved evidence was already finished, and what remained was simply the outcome, and I told them both calmly that this was the last conversation we would have like this, not because I needed distance, but because everything that mattered had already been decided. The accounts were separated, the access was removed, the legal process had already been set in motion, not as a reaction, but as a conclusion, something that followed naturally from everything I had seen, and I watched as that realization settled in deeper than anything else I had said, because this was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, something that had already happened whether they accepted it or not, and for a moment, no one spoke, the room holding that same heavy stillness. But now it was different, not uncertain, but final, and I stood there, looking at two people I had once trusted completely, and realized that what I felt was not anger, not even loss in the way I had expected, but something much quieter, something closer to closure. Because the hardest part of something like this is not the ending, it is the confusion that comes before it, the not knowing, the second guessing, the questioning of your own reality. And that part was over, and I turned away, not dramatically, not with any need to make a point, just a simple decision to step out of a situation that no longer had anything left for me. And as I walked toward the door, I understood something I had not fully grasped before, that what they had taken from me was never the house, never the money, not even the time. It was the assumption that trust did not need to be protected. And that was the only thing I was not going to carry forward, because everything else, the work, the structure, the life I had built, that was still mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something steady again, not because things had gone back to normal, but because I had removed everything that was not. And sometimes, that is what control really looks like, not holding on to something that is broken, but knowing exactly when to let it go and walk away without looking back.